Good morning and welcome to this month's webinar, where we shall be looking at how employers can ensure that there is a trans and gender equality within the workplace. So before we make a start, we would like to introduce ourselves as normal. And for those of you who have not joined any of our previous webinars, I'm Victoria Templeton, one of the HR Knowledge Managers here at HR Solutions. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Terry Hayward. He is a HR and training consultant, and Terry will be supporting in our poll discussions, and with his experience and knowledge as a HR consultant will also help support in the question and answers at the end of this webinar. We also have Drew, who will be supporting in the background from a technical point of view. Hopefully we shouldn't have any technical issues, but we have Drew there to help us. And because we have so many of you who have joined us today, then we've all placed you on mute. But as I said a moment ago, we do want to hear questions. So when we see this slide, that means we're at the end of the webinar and ready to take your live questions. So here's a quick run-through guide as to how you can raise your questions for us. So on the screen now, you'll see an image of what your GoToWebinar panel looks like. Just simply type your question in the question pane, and then we'll aim to read as many as we can at the end of the webinar. Also, to make our webinar as interactive as possible, we do like to run a few polls throughout. So when you see this slide, it means that a poll will be coming up. And Terry and I will launch those polls, and hopefully you'll get some interesting information and have a discussion on the back of those. Just note, though, that when you do want to vote in the poll, you do need to be out of the full screen mode, as for some reason GoToWebinar polls only works when in normal view. So before I start, I would just like to run through what we'll be covering today. And to begin with, I shall provide an introduction on today's topic, which will then lead nicely on to talking about the importance of having a workplace culture that supports trans and gender equality. I'll then share with you what it means to be transgender, after which I'll share with you how, as an employer, you can support trans and gender equality in your workplace. I'll then come on specifically to talking about when a person transitions, how to manage the practical side of that from an employment perspective to help raise awareness on that topic. And then to end, we have several items of guidance that are helpful on the subject. So I wanted to obviously share what those are, and then we'll finish with Terry and I taking your questions. So before we consider how trans and gender equality can be supported at work, it's important to understand what is meant by the terms trans and gender equality. So first of all, the word trans is an alternative word to transgender, and actually it's an umbrella term for someone who experiences gender incongruence, gender diversity, or gender dysphoria, meaning that a person is uneasy or not in harmony with their gender and or sex. So it doesn't just only apply to someone who is transitioning, as we will find out later in the webinar. And when we think of gender equality in the workplace, this means people of all genders who have an equal rights and opportunities, whether that's in respect of recruitment and promotion, career progression, equal pay and benefits, training and development. So that's really important, and we'll come on to talk about that more as we go through the webinar. But let's consider the importance of creating trans equality in the workplace. And there are several reasons why it's important to build a workplace culture that's inclusive of transgender equality. So first of all, it's morally important. By treating employees with dignity and respect, and recognising that people have many great things in common as well as having many great differences that sets them apart, we all want to treat people just how we wish to be treated ourselves. And it's the right thing to do. Secondly, it leads to having a diverse workforce, which is hugely beneficial to any employer because it brings different ideas, views, backgrounds and experiences to the workplace, and all of which can enhance creativity as well as promoting fairness and equality. But also, just as important, it ensures that you have provided a great place to work and can help you to attract new recruits to your business. And finally, by having a trans and gender equality in the workplace, it means you are a legally responsible employer, which means it will help to safeguard the organisation from potential employment tribunal claims. And we know that employers have a legal obligation under the Equality Act to protect individuals from unfair treatment and discrimination on the grounds of a protected characteristic. And so if discrimination occurs connected to someone's transition or their sexual orientation, for instance, we know they're protected under the Equality Act. And this not only applies to employees, but it applies to job applicants as well as other types of workers, casual, seasonal staff as well. So now we'll consider what it means to be transgender. And I'll be sharing with you a lot of information that hopefully will help in people's awareness and understanding. So, as I said a moment ago, trans or transgender is an umbrella term for how someone identifies themselves. And as you can see, transgender is not limited to someone who intends to undergo or is undergoing or has undergone gender transition. And as you can see from this slide and the next one that will come up, there are various ways in which people wish to identify themselves, whether it's by gender, who that's someone that considers themselves to be both male and female at different times. Cisgender is where the person's sex assigned at birth and gender identity are matching. You have dead naming, so calling someone by their birth name after they've changed their name is known as a phrase dead naming. You have gender dysphoria and incongruence, which I've mentioned those words a moment ago, and that's where the person experiences distress due to the mismatch between the sex they were assigned at birth and the gender they identify with. And we know from statistics that that then also can bring mental health, which we'll come on to later. Gender fluid is someone who changes how they feel about their gender from time to time, may identify as a woman on some days and a man on others, or as a combination of both. Gender neutral is where someone who does not identify with any gender but may embrace aspects of both man and woman and may possibly fall on a spectrum between the two. And gender reassignment or transitioning, that's the process by which a person aligns their life and physical identity to match their gender identity. And then just a few further definitions that will be helpful to everyone. We also have the gender recognition certificate, and that certificate enables an individual to be legally recognised in their affirmed gender. You have what's known as intersex. That's a physical medical condition. It describes someone whose anatomy or physiology differs to what constitutes either male or female. And in some intersex conditions, it can mean that the person's anatomy or physiology is neither male nor female. And then non-binary, that's where a person has identifies as a male or female. They may say they're neither gender or may have some other sense of gender. There could be pangender, which is where individuals who feel they cannot be labelled as female or male. Polygender is where individuals are attracted to people of multiple genders. And then there's also third gender, individuals who do not identify as male or female, but rather as neither both or combination of male and female genders. And then you have transgender. So someone who has a gender identity which differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, language continues to evolve, and so it's really important to note that this list that I've just gone through, and you will get a copy of the slides after today's webinar, but it's important that this list isn't exhaustive. And actually, it's really important for employees to keep up to date with how gender equality evolves, because it's really, really crucially important that the correct language and pronouns are used within the workplace. So from a workplace perspective, how can employees support trans employees? So we're going to start off with our first poll. And Terry, if I could ask you to call up the first poll for me, please. And this is, do you monitor equality and diversity in your organisation? So we'll wait a few more minutes for votes to come in. Okay, let's close the poll and see what the results are. Brilliant. So we have 78% of you do monitor equality and diversity, which is really good. We have 22% of you that don't. So, you know, I think monitoring equality and diversity is really important for several reasons. But for me, it allows an organisation to assess where there's perhaps areas that aren't fairly represented, and it gives an employer that knowledge, that insight into the makeup of its workforce, and so then can look to see about how it can move forward in becoming a more diverse workplace and what that action plan could look like to help do so. Don't know, Terry, if you've got any comments you wish to add on that.
Yeah, I'd agree with what you say there. I think sometimes the challenge is if you're in a very small organisation where there's only like a handful of you, it might not be something you feel it's necessary to do right now. But that's it's worth keeping it in mind as your business grows, to keep in mind of monitoring diversity. It's really important because, you know, as a business grows, different managers are making decisions around recruitment, around promotion, around who gets certain development needs. And it gives you a good opportunity because this stuff starts disappearing out of sight. So it's always useful to have that, to make sure that any decisions, you know, any recruitment decisions, any promotion decisions, who you're bringing into the business, that it has a sort of a useful level of diversity, or are you just taking from the same pot each and every time? Because diversity, as we know, it's very important to you know, to have a bit of diversity in the business, to challenge ideas. We all come from different backgrounds, and we're not just talking about, you know, not just talking about one particular area of diversity, but it's a really useful thing to have. So it's a really great thing to monitor as well.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. And can you call up the second webinar, the second poll even, please? And this should be whether you have a trans and gender equality policy in place. Should we wait a few more seconds? Perhaps close the poll now. See what the results are. So we have 29% of you do have a transgender policy in place, 71% of you don't. And I think it continues to evolve, doesn't it? And we continue to see questions come up on the subject. And I think there's now more of a need for workplaces to, I guess, have guidance for managers and employees on how transgender equality can be supported at work and what it means. So I think, you know, I'm seeing in the press, you know, lots of communications about trans and gender equality. More and more organisations are bringing in a policy specific to that, rather than just having a diversity policy that just covers everything. And I think that's also as well because certain elements of transgender, so for example, someone who is transitioning, then there are very important practical steps that should be taken, and a careful, sensitive approach to how it's managed. And that's where having a standalone trans and gender equality policy can help managers and employees. And we'll come on to that later in the webinar. So that's interesting. Thank you, everybody, for that. And then our final poll in this section is around, do you provide equality training, which includes transgender in the workplace? Okay, a few more seconds. Okay, Should we close the poll? And thank you. So 40% of you don't incorporate transgender in the equality training, 60% of you do. So perhaps Terry, you might want to comment, because I know you run a lot of training sessions on equality, diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely, the most, I think, popular training course that we run actually is on equality in the workplace, funnily enough. Yeah, I think it's absolutely important to have that within your equality training, as it is with any other area that comes under a protected characteristic. Why do I say that? Well, the simple reason is because if something were to happen, were there a case of harassment or bullying in the workplace on the basis of someone being transgender, how would you then fight that in an employment tribunal? What's your defence? Because what you haven't done is given anybody any training on that. You've not made people aware. You've not maybe made them aware of their responsibility in doing that. I know we all like to think it's common sense, but actually it would form part of your defence if you'd done everything that you possibly can to prevent that from happening. And one of the important areas of that is within training that you give to your staff.
Brilliant. Perfectly put, Terry.
Thank you.
So yes, that's really insightful. Thank you. And then I think we've got their next poll now, just the final one in this section, which is, do you offer separate training? For those of you that have answered the previous one as yes, you do provide it. Do you offer separate training for line managers as to what you offer employees? Okay, let's see what the results are. 65% of you don't, 35% of you do. And I think what's important to bear in mind is, training is absolutely fundamental for the reasons Terry's just set out. And when you think of a line manager and their role and responsibilities, it's slightly different to an employee because they're responsible for managing people. They have responsibilities. So when it comes to supporting somebody that is transitioning, they're the ones that will be supporting that employee. They'll be the ones that will agree to any measures that need to be brought in place. And so I think it calls for having a slightly different training offering for line managers, specifically on transgender in the workplace, whereas your generic diversity training for all employees is about raising awareness and educating, but it won't necessarily include the practical steps because they're not managing somebody. I don't know, Terry, if you want to add anything to that, but I would always recommend having both line management and employee training.
Yeah, sometimes again it depends on the size of the business as to whether it's practical to do that. But where you can, yeah, it is for the reasons you just said there, because you do, as a manager, have different responsibilities, and sometimes where it goes wrong is where managers don't take the responsibility for dealing with it, either maybe because they don't have the knowledge, or in some cases don't feel comfortable with dealing with it, and then just let things pass. That's where grievances come. That's where employment tribunal cases come from, and that's when it all starts getting costly and time consuming.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Terry. So let's close that poll and I'll carry on with the webinar. So there are many ways in which an employer can support trans employees, and this is the section now of the webinar. We're going to look at that, and it's whether it's ensuring there's equality and diversity training like we've just spoke about to help educate the workforce, or adapting employment policies to ensure the needs of everyone are met, such as your dress code policy. Or it could be how you manage communications within the workplace. And we'll look at these in more detail, but this summary page just goes to show all the different aspects of the workplace that should be given consideration when supporting trans employees at work. And we'll look at these in more detail. And the first important way in which an employer can support transgender employees is to ensure that they are protected from discrimination. So those who transition or those who are in same-sex relationships and civil partnerships will be protected by these protected characteristics under the Equality Act. This means they're protected against unfair treatment and less favourable treatment on the grounds of their protected characteristic. And so it means having effective policies in place and ensuring that any complaints that are raised about bullying and harassment are dealt with promptly. And that's how employers can support employees from protecting them from being subjected to discrimination. You also need to consider a person's right to confidentiality. So if we think about someone's sexual orientation and health is what we know as special category data for the purpose of the GDPR regulations. And this means that data relating to someone's sexual orientation and health needs more protection than other types of data due to its sensitivity. And it's also reasonable to conclude that medical data relating to the gender reassignment process is also special category data, although the GDPR doesn't actually explicit this, but it would be fair to assume it does, given that the gender reassignment process includes, can include the medical treatment and interventions. So ensuring you comply with GDPR is vital. And there will be certain actions that employers must take when it comes to those employees who transition, which we'll come on to a little bit later in the webinar. But it is essential because you also gain the trust and confidence of your employees, that they will feel satisfied that the confidentiality of their circumstances and situation is treated seriously. And another way of supporting transgender employees is the use of effective communications. So it could be general company-wide communications. So you could use your handbooks, your policies, any memos, team briefings. All of these methods of communicating to the wider workforce can all help to promote and raise awareness around diversity, transgender in the workplace. And it will ultimately help you to build your inclusive workplace culture. We then need to consider communications specific to those employees who transition. So, you know, whether they're using medical procedures or not. And I think the important thing to say here is that it's really extremely important to take the lead from the employee in terms of communication. So what I mean is, you know, how much information is to be communicated, if at all, to whom, how and when. And allowing the employee to take the lead will then help them to take control in how others become aware and take control of their own circumstances and situation in the workplace. And we also need to consider the huge importance of training, which we have touched on. So as we've said, all employers should be providing equality, diversity and inclusion training. That helps to create a diverse and inclusive workplace culture. And it shouldn't just be limited to line managers. All employees should receive that training and education on gender equality. And it's about raising an employee's awareness, setting out responsibilities, and to cater for the fact that for line managers, they may be making decisions around equality and diversity. And so it's really important that training takes place. And it shouldn't be seen as a one-off event either. A huge important area is around language, and it's really important to ensure that the correct language is used. So being respectful to someone includes using the correct language and pronouns with them. The language and pronoun for how they would like to be known is very personal to each person, and we do need to rely on the employee telling us of this so that we can fully embrace their identity. What's also really important is that intentionally or misgendering another employee persistently can be deemed as harassment or bullying. And I think it's fair to say that if by accident an employee was referred to as the wrong gender, then to acknowledge that error, apologise to that person and making every effort to get it correct would most likely be seen as acceptable to the person, because that individual can feel that, yes, it was genuinely in error, it wasn't meant, the person is clearly trying to use the right pronouns and language, but if it continues or if there's that lack of sense that someone is really trying to make the effort, that's when it borders on becoming, you know, offensive to a person. Another way in which employers can support transgender in the workplace is about making sure they deal with inappropriate conduct, and it also comes part and parcel of dealing with complaints as well. So take action on inappropriate conduct and deal with your complaints quickly and thoroughly. It is necessary to maintain to do this for maintaining a inclusive, diverse workplace culture. And it goes without saying that employers must address bullying and harassment and discrimination. So the two frameworks in place that you would have is your disciplinary and grievance procedures. Obviously use them as appropriate. Some organisations have separate bullying policies, so just ensure that if you do, then that you're working in line with those policies as well. And finally, in this area of support, before we look specifically at transitioning, it's important to recognise how helpful EAP and employment policies are. So in terms of EAP, this is really important because we know from research that mental ill health disproportionately impacts those who are transgender by almost 4 times. Now that's according to the World Health Organization. We also know that mental health can arise because of transphobia and discrimination, hence why the importance of having clear procedures and taking action if any of that occurs at work. And it also affects those who suffer from gender dysphoria. That's a term, as I said, that describes the unease that someone feels because of the mismatch between their biological sex and gender identity. And in terms of the EAP, I don't know if many of you know, but if you have an EAP service, quite often that will be a useful tool and available to line managers. You know, so as a line manager, you know, it's a difficult subject to, I guess, fully understand, and perhaps you've never dealt with situations in the past where somebody may be transitioning, and so having that EAP as a resource for you will help you in managing that individual. And then if we think about employment policies, then as a workplace, you should be considering how other policies play a part in supporting transgender employees. So if we think about the dress code, making sure that you can adapt the dress code so that at various stages of somebody's transition process, that you're able to make them feel comfortable. Family-friendly policies as well should be incorporating the fact that, you know, same-sex families and the rights that will come to, for those employees in that situation. And also, you know, we've talked a lot recently about the menopause, and, you know, we've introduced a menopause policy this year. Actually, that needs to be reflective of transgender employees, because individuals can still undergo the menopause. Or if somebody is transitioning, then the medication and the medical side of things can provide similar effects to what somebody going through the menopause would receive. And then always review and update your company policies, so make sure they continue to be inclusive of transgender employees, and consider developing, like I've said earlier on the webinar, about a dedicated trans and gender equality policy for your workplace. So I'm now going to focus specifically on gender transition and the practical steps of supporting somebody that is transitioning or has transitioned or is going to. I've spoken already about the word transgender is an umbrella term for all the different ways in which someone can identify themselves. However, the word transgender can also be specific to someone who has a gender identity which differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So it really is important to understand gender transition from this perspective. The first thing to say is not everyone who transitions undergoes medical procedures to align their physical identity to match their gender identity. They may simply prefer to live their life in all other ways as the gender to which they identify. They too, though, will be protected from discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment, just as those who undergo medical procedures when transitioning. And that came on the back of a case ruling that some of you may be familiar with, was the Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover. The actual medical process when transitioning is called gender reassignment. And from a legal perspective, we have the Gender Recognition Act of 2004. And it's under this act that we now do not require a person to have a gender recognition certificate in order to be protected under the Equality Act of 2010. In order to be protected on the grounds of gender reassignment under the Equality Act, then there is a prescriptive scope in which who it applies to. So it would be for those who are proposing to undergo a process or part of a process, are currently undergoing a process or part of a process, and have undergone a process or part of a process. And as I just said a moment ago, the tribunal ruling in Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover confirmed that an employee does not have to undergo any surgical reassignment. They can simply live in their chosen identity and still be protected by the Equality Act on the grounds of gender reassignment. So I'm not sure if any of you are aware, but there's someone called Shula Baylor. He's an international speaker, author and advocate for trans inclusion, radical body acceptance and mental health awareness. And he has a website that's full of educational information about trans inclusion and uses Instagram to help educate. And I thought it would be helpful to hear from his perspective what it means to him. So he was assigned female at birth and he transitioned. And this is what he says. He says, saying that I was born a girl implies, already directly states that I was once a girl, which I was not. Although I haven't always had the words, resources or courage to explain myself, I have always been me, a man. Even when I looked like a girl, I was still me, a boy. That is, transition is not about changing genders, it's about shifting presentation to match the already existing identity. I did not change who I am, I did not change my gender, I just gained the vocabulary, freedom and confidence to express myself authentically. And I think this is a really important and insightful view that really helps to understand what it means when somebody has transitioned. And so when you read this, I do think it helps you to understand that someone who transitions, you know, they have always been the gender to which they now identify. He just didn't have the words or courage to say so. So I thought that was quite helpful to share to everybody to get a perspective on transgender. And he further goes on to say around what some correct phrases would be and what incorrect phrases would be when talking about somebody who's transitioned. So you wouldn't say he was born a girl, but you would say he was assigned female at birth. You wouldn't say when he was a girl, you could say when he presented as female. You wouldn't say he changed genders, you would say he transitioned. And you wouldn't say before he became a boy, you would say before he transitioned. And you wouldn't say he turned into a boy, you would say he transitioned. And I think that reflects effectively what that paragraph was I said a moment ago. For him, he's always been a boy, a man. So that's why it's not acceptable for him for somebody to say that he was born a girl. Instead, it's saying he was assigned female at birth. He has transitioned. So understanding language, terminology is really, really important. It can be difficult, and that's why education and awareness and really understanding somebody's perspective really helps. So I thought that was also helpful to illustrate language. So if we consider someone who transitions, then it is important to note that it's their personal choice if they inform their employer of their intention to transition. They don't actually have to. It's also recommended that if you have an employee who is transitioning or plans to, that there is a personalised transition plan that's put in place that can support both the line manager as well as the employee as they undergo their transitioning. So it supports the transition before, during and after, and allows the business to manage appropriately the practical needs of their employee and how these are to be managed, as well as how other policies can be adapted to support the individual. A transition plan is crucial. Now, it should be subjected to review, because what we need to acknowledge and understand is, as an individual progresses through their transition, their health and medical needs change, and therefore the measures that you may have in the workplace may evolve and may need revisiting. I think the most important thing to say around transition plans is that they have to remain confidential. So I spoke about special category data, and whilst gender reassignment isn't specifically listed in GDPR, information relating to people's medical records and health is. So there's the obligation of maintaining strict confidentiality, and in this situation you would need to store the transition plan securely. You need to restrict the access as to only those authorised to have access to it. So this would be the employee, the line manager, and any other relevant person that's been agreed between you and the employee. So it doesn't just sit in your normal personnel file with everybody else's personal files that's readily accessible by everybody who accesses personal files in your workplace. That it has to be stored separately and securely, only allowing access to those that were authorised and agreed with the employee. And so, bearing in mind these things that I've just gone through, that's why I think it's important to develop a specific policy for how you manage transgender in the workplace, and that it should incorporate steps for managers and employees on how the transition process will be supported and managed before, during and after. Now, if we're still thinking about transitioning, then if we think about the workplace facilities, they need to be considered in order to support a transgender employee in the workplace. So first of all, the first thing to say is employees who have transitioned must be allowed to use facilities that are appropriate to their gender. You must not require transgender employees to use unisex or disabled toilets. They may choose to use them, but that's their choice. You cannot require that they do so. These practical arrangements will take effect once they've started living in the acquired gender on a full-time basis. And it applies to every transgender employee, regardless of whether they've chosen to transition with the use of medical treatment or not. And then from a health and safety perspective, be aware that there's likely to be different workplace health and safety needs at various stages of somebody's transition. You know, there may be periods where certain duties have to be avoided, such as heavy physical work. It all depends on where they are in their transition and the type of role they undertake, obviously, and how their transition is affecting them physically and emotionally. So just think about health and safety adjustments should be revisited and reviewed regularly. And then both parties must agree and capture in the transition plan all the practical arrangements that you're offering and putting in place. So the health and safety adjustments, you know, the use of toilets, etc. Your transition plan is a key document helping both parties as they progress through their transition. We also need to think about dress code. So consider how you can flex the dress code rules to support the employee through transitioning to help them feel more comfortable. And we should be offering workplaces that are very supportive of someone wearing clothing appropriate to their gender. If you provide uniforms, then these must be provided to the employee in their corresponding gender. And what's really important is through your transition plan that you discuss and agree an effective date for when this takes place from. It's all about discussion with your individual, isn't it? And coming to an agreement and seeing what it is that the individual wants and from when. So capture in your transition plan, if there are uniforms to be that have to be worn, then at what point in time will the individual want to wear the uniform that corresponds with their gender? If we think about absence management, then transitioning related absences are treated in the same way as other sickness or medical related absences. So what you can think about is, as we do with any kind of absence management process where there's perhaps a disability, or in this case with transitioning, if you need to make reasonable adjustments to either the process and how you manage absence, you know, that would be reasonable to support. What I would say is, where possible, be as flexible as you can in dealing with any requests for short notice time out of the business that may crop up to do with their transitioning process. It could be medical appointments, it could be counselling, but just be as flexible as you possibly can. Obviously bearing in mind your business needs, you should try and be as flexible as you can. And a really important point is occupational health. You know, I've said this before in other webinars about general absence management. We're not medical experts. We rely on medical experts to provide us with medical-based information to help raise our awareness and to educate us, but to give us an understanding of how somebody's health and medical conditions can affect the workplace, and therefore what adjustments we need to provide and offer. So occupational health is something that you can consider. Obviously you need somebody's agreement and consent to going down that avenue, and it is really about supporting how they can best support the person, and that's how it should be perceived by the individual. It's not for any other means, it's simply so that you can best support them at work. And of course you may want to seek further medical advice either from their GP or from a specialist, a treating specialist, whatever I guess is appropriate to the situation or the area that you're discussing with the individual. And finally, when it comes to transitioning transgender employees, it's really important to be mindful of your own employee records and systems that you have in place. So you need to understand what records and systems will need changing. You also need to understand from when. You should be discussing what records will be changing. So that will include records that you hold with third parties. So if you think about HMRC, pensions, if you have any private medical plans, etc. So when you're sitting with your employee working out your transition plan, one part of it should be covering off how you manage changing your employer records and systems and notification of external parties, and then make sure that that's captured in your transition plan. So I'm going to run a final poll, and it's really just revisiting a poll that we ran earlier. So Terry, if I could ask you to launch it, and it's in light of today's webinar and the information that we've gone through, will you develop a transgender equality policy? Just give it a few more moments. Okay, thank you. So brilliant, yes, so 95% of you would, so that's great news, and 5% no, and it may be that you address it in any of your existing policies. So yeah, that's good. And I think, you know, hopefully the information that I've gone through, it is an area that changes, evolves. It really is an area where, you know, it's important for people to be up to date on the current terminology, language, and so it can get a little bit complicated if you're not used to you know, managing somebody going through a transition process, etc. So having that policy is actually not just for the employee, but for you as line managers. And it just is that little bit of a support tool, isn't it? If you've got that policy that helps you to know what to do when and where to go externally if you want some external support, etc. So thank you for that. And then before we move on to questions and answers, I just wanted to share with you sources of guidance that's available out there that may be helpful to you. So these, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the Beaumont Society, Equality and Advisory Support Services. So there's lots and lots of help and support out there. As I said, if you're already offering an EAP service in your business, then that will be another source of support. If you have your own in-house HR team, then obviously they can help support and guide, or obviously if you don't, then you know you can use third-party HR providers. So there's lots of information and guidance out there. And definitely training and educating the workforce helps massively in bringing any policy to life and just making sure employees are supported and treated, you know, fairly. So this slide now is just to let you know that if you're an existing knowledge base member, there is lots of information on our knowledge base. So there is actually a transgender policy that you can download. We have articles on discrimination from a protected characteristic point of view for gender reassignment. We've got a practical guidance on managing transitions in the workplace. So there's lots of useful information there, historic webinars that you can watch on demand. So do access it if you are a knowledge base member. If you're not, and you probably want to find a little bit more about that, then there's a link there that you can access to help you find out more about that. So what we would like to do now is take questions. So Terry, have we had many questions come in?
We've had a few questions come in, actually. Yes.
Okay.
Let's start with this one, which is back from when we started. We may have answered it since, which is, could you quantify exactly what you mean by monitoring? So in terms of equality monitoring, we have a small organisation.
So monitoring is, so it's not, so when I mentioned it at the very outset, it's not just specific to transgender, ethnicity, obviously gender, disability, all the areas within a workforce or protected characteristics within a workforce, so that you can then take steps to, if you need to make it a more diverse workplace or promote it more, that's where that information will help you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that answer the question?
Answers it for me. Hopefully that's it. But that person has a further question, just drop that into the questions box.
Absolutely.
Okay. Language is changing very rapidly. Who decides the new names and how are we informed?
So it's all about the employee and their own personal preferences and choices. So we do rely very much on our employee sharing with us of a new pronoun or how they're to be referred to. So we need to wait for them to come to us to tell us.
Yeah, in some respects, it's just like any other kind of language. Language evolves all the time. But as managers, certainly if we're in the field of HR, it's up to us to keep abreast of this kind of thing. So, you know, keep in touch with things like this. Come on webinars. You know, keep an eye on some of those websites that Victoria put there. You know, language will change over time. Inevitably, it does for absolutely everything. Unfortunately, I don't think that it gets announced as such. It's something we pick up over time. But you know, I would say, you know, stay in touch with these websites and webinars and all sources of information on it. But yeah, communication with individuals are massively important.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of questions on the same. Actually, I'll quickly do this one, which is, can you suggest any organisations or resources that would be useful for developing a robust transgender and gender equality policy? Where would we find advice and what to include? Well, you've listed some there, but I'm going to say HR Solutions as well to add that to the list.
Yeah, we do have one, and actually, I'm not sure if this this person is a member of the knowledge base. If you have access to the knowledge base, you can download it for free, because obviously it's part of your membership. So it will be in the documents area. If you aren't a member of the knowledge base, if you take a look at our website and go onto our document shop, I believe we've recently added our transgender policy on there, so you can have a look at getting it there. If you struggle in any way, contact us and we'll be more than happy to help you.
Okay. A couple of questions on this, broadly on the same subject, actually. One that says, what about an employee who is in the process of transitioning with the toilet facilities, if they were to ask which toilet they should use? And a second question on the same subject, one large challenge is we have trans staff who want to use female toilets and females who want a female-only space, excluding trans women. We're struggling to get clear guidance on this. We went for unisex, but then some female staff complained that they wanted female toilets. What's your current view on this, and is there any clear legal guidance?
Well, from a legal perspective, the employee that has transitioned, who was assigned male at birth but is now female, they have the right to use female toilets. That's the legal position.
Yeah, and I think that's quite clear.
Yeah, from a practical perspective, so when you're in discussions with your employee about the general transition plan, toilets and facilities will come into those conversations, and so it's understanding from the employee the timescales of their transition and at what point they want to be using the facilities and toilets in their new gender. And then from another practical perspective, if you're facing concerns by other female employees that are saying they feel uncomfortable with somebody using their facilities who was assigned male at birth, then it's trying to understand what is it specifically that they're concerned with and trying to educate them. Not only is it the person's right, but morally how we want to treat people, we should be treating people like how we want to be treated. And if I think back to that quote I said earlier, that chap has always recognised themselves as being a boy, being a male, even though they had been identified, assigned female at birth. They've always known themselves to be male. So in this case, you have a female that was assigned male at birth. I would imagine that they'll also have always known themselves to be female. And so it's about respecting that person's perspective, their beliefs, their feelings. Yeah. And so it's having that conversation with the employee about trying to educate them.
Absolutely right. I think I would echo that by saying, look, this may be something that if you haven't had that lived experience, it might be difficult to understand. But let's flip that around. If you've got people saying that to you, well, we don't restrict people of different religions from using specific toilets. We don't restrict or exclude people from certain sexual orientations from using toilets. We don't exclude people certain races. It's one of those things that we've learned. All those things were new at some time, and people had to understand it and get familiar with it. I'm sure there were barriers and challenges over the decades, and this is maybe something that's where Victoria's absolutely right. That's where the education part comes in.
Definitely.
Okay. One question, which is more of a practical one: is the knowledge base free, or is there a cost?
There is a cost. I don't know it offhand, but if you want to, we've got well, you can either contact us on the details at the end of this webinar slide. We're going to run a poll shortly to ask if people want us to follow up with them after the event on any of our services, so we can do that as well. So there is a cost for that, but I'm sorry, I can't remember the price.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's all your templates, all the policies you could think of, articles on all aspects of human resource management that are user friendly because they're written from for a line manager's perspective and not HR legal jargon. And there's template letters, guidance forms, everything. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I think, sorry, just not as a question, but Alex has made a bit of a comment there, and it is right. It's not just about people who have transitioned; it's about people who are transitioning as well. They don't, or not even having any kind of surgery. They still have that same right to use those toilets. You need to look at making those accommodations, and communication is absolutely key.
Yeah.
Okay. Want some more questions, or do you want to?
Yeah. Have you got? If everybody's got time, I mean, I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer.
Okay, 2 or 3 more. I've got what is in a transition plan? So you referred to that earlier.
Yeah.
What is actually in the plan?
Yeah. So I've spoken a lot about it, but if you think of it as a working tool, a practical tool. So it's for both the employees' purpose and the manager's use. So what you want to have captured in it is, first of all, the name of the person that's going to be the support and point of contact for the individual who's transitioning. They'll be the person that will sign off the plan with the employee. You then need to consider and mapping it out into your plan. So how and who will inform colleagues and the organisation, and what information will be communicated and when it comes to the person's transition. You need to agree with the employee and map it into your plan how confidentiality will be maintained, and recognising the employee's wishes. The use of a new name, title, pronoun, then understand at what point in time that will be used from. Map out any records that will need changing and from the date they're to be changed from, as well as any third-party records. So like I've said earlier, HMRC, pensions. It's good to have an idea of an anticipated or expected timeline of the transition process. And that's where we rely on our employees to inform us based on the advice they're having from their consultant. And at what point they expect to be taking up their new identity. If they know it, they may not know it. Things like medical appointments and planned absences, it's really helpful to get them tracked and planned, so you can plan for time out of the workplace in advance. Dress code, so a lot of these things that we've covered in the webinar. So dress code, doesn't need to be any changes, adaptations for the employee. Do you think occupational health will be relevant? If so, perhaps when do you anticipate seeking occupational health? And training, include any requirements for training. It might be training specifically to the immediate team, so people's own awareness is helped, or it might be company-wide training. Perhaps there needs to be a further refresher, so things like that. So all the practical things you need to think about when they're going to be using the facilities. Yeah, so lots of things, but really it's a tool, a working tool that you'll keep revisiting, review, update if necessary, and it must be kept securely and separate from all other personal information in their file and only limited to those authorised to access it.
Yeah. Okay.
So, lots in there.
Lots in there, definitely are. Next question: how would you suggest we go about training our workforce and managers, and what would the differences be, and how frequent? Well, I think I'll probably field that one.
Yep.
In terms of training, how would you suggest we go about training workforce and managers? Well, we talked about that earlier. I think either do it as part of your, it should be included as part of your equality training, in which case, how frequent? Well, that's a good point. Well, certainly new people into your business should be made aware of the policy, and perhaps there's a bit of training that could be given there. But also maybe on like a 2-year cycle, and it depends on what's going to work with your employees. As a bit of a reminder, whether it's face-to-face training, and I love going in and delivering face-to-face training because you can do a lot of activities, get people up and moving. It's a subject that people are aware of and have a lot of interest in, funnily enough, if you make it engaging for people, and that's where I found it really interesting. And sometimes if people are comfortable in the group, they share some of their lived experiences, or if not, we share some of those lived experiences either through videos or something else. But also, so whether it's online, whether some people do e-learning, as long as the topic is covered somewhere, that I think is the important part of it. If you're looking for specific training on transgender rights or as a whole, absolutely, either look for someone who's going to put that session together, like we can deliver something like that. Or what is also really good, are there certain organisations who will have transgender organisations who will come in and raise the awareness, perhaps to a group of managers, of their experience, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
If you get people to come and do that, because when we're faced with something that we're not familiar with, it gives us the opportunity to empathise a bit more and understand from someone's point of view or for someone's perspective, rather than just have a bit of e-learning that ticks a few boxes. So I would say it's important to it's important either to get that lived experience or just to really incorporate it. Well, definitely important to incorporate it in your, not just your training, but also in your policies.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
I think we've got a last question here, which is, let me just find it. Why separate sex and gender?
Okay, so this, I think there's a lot of debate, isn't there? Or lots of, I've seen it in the news recently, but so sex, it's important, you have to distinguish. Sex is the biological and physiological, can't say it, characteristic that are assigned when you're born. Gender, on the other hand, is how someone will identify themselves, and that's the broad spectrum that I've gone through early on in the webinar, about non-binary, gender fluid. So gender is how the person identifies themselves. Sex is the biological characteristics of someone when they were that they've been assigned at birth.
Yeah.
And if you, I guess, just thinking about that quote earlier by Shula Bailar, now he says that his gender has always been that of a male. He just didn't know how to communicate it or was confident to do so. But he says that his sex was assigned at birth was female. So he's recognizing the physiology and biological side of him was female, but he's always identified as his gender being male.
Yeah. And Alex in the questions has made summarised it. It's quite appropriate there, because they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's all the questions we have.
Thank you very much for everybody sending those questions in. So I'm going to move on the webinar. Let's just go back to the slides. I do want to just run this quick poll. Sorry, Teo, if I just need your help again. And I mentioned it a moment ago. So if you do want us to follow up with you after today's webinar, because you want to find out more about our services, whether it's our HR services, HR training, the knowledge base, health and safety services and training, or payroll, then do let us know. So I think we've got a poll that we can launch. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And thank you very much for that. And then I'm going to just run through just a few closing slides now. So we do have some HR management and development training. And as I've got you on the webinar, Terry, I think this is a perfect slide for you.
Oh, yes. Okay, so yes, our next equality and inclusion session is for the 6th of September at 9:30, where we cover all the topics. It's a 3.5-hour session, as most of them on there, I think, which covers all the topics around equality and inclusion, including transgender and gender reassignment. Holding difficult conversations in the workplace, perfect course again, a bit of a half-day course there online for any situations you find where you may find it difficult to have a certain conversation. And there's all sorts of reasons why a conversation might be difficult with a member of staff, but it's a good way to get a structure and to think about the awareness of that. Also coming up in October, we've got employment law for managers. I think we've only got the one date there, but it's split over 2 dates. It covers everything you need to know. If you think about the life cycle of an employee, from beginning, from when they join you, or from recruitment through to when they leave, it's a good opportunity for managers who either got a little bit of knowledge or maybe very no knowledge at all to come along and learn a bit about each of the processes that they might experience or encounter as managers managing staff throughout an employee's life cycle. And also later on in October, we've got managing the disciplinary procedure. We used to run it as disciplinary and grievances, but I found actually, do you know what? They're two big topics on their own. So managing the disciplinary procedure is, of course, in October, where we run through all the stages of it, plus give you some good advice and top tips to take away with you. And similarly, in November, we've got effective appraisal skills, doing exactly the same thing, thinking about what is important to the performance cycle, how to set smart objectives, because we all know what they are, but actually setting them is another thing. Do we always use them? And also how to approach those meetings, especially where you might have to give more tricky feedback. So all those courses are running throughout the autumn. There are others as well, which you'll be able to see on our website, which is at the bottom there.
Brilliant, thank you. So let's on to the next slide, and we have some health and safety training as well coming up. So level 2 fire safety, fire marshal training. We have mental health ambassador training. The dates are currently being scheduled. We're seeing a lot of requests for mental health training at the moment. And we're also doing the emergency first aid at work, as well as food safety. Now, in terms of webinars, these are the ones that are currently set up. So we have directors' responsibilities in health and safety, fire safety and law, and safeguarding in the workplace. But don't worry, we do also have new HR ones being added. I just need to get them launched and live. So our plan is to run the following webinars. So managing a successful return to work, managing a successful return to in-person work, social events. Obviously, in the lead up to Christmas, we're probably going to be seeing more in-person Christmas events. Managing an effective redundancy, so preparing for change, working with trade unions. These two last ones in particular are probably going to be a subject that's going to be spoken about quite a bit over the coming months, given everything that's with the cost of living crisis, and we're seeing more trade union presence and requests for recognition. We're going to be looking at 2023. I know it's August, but we need to plan for the year ahead. And then in 2023, some of the ones we're going to be running are 10 things to consider when managing people, hybrid working and contracts of employment, because the whole world of work has shifted in terms of how we now operate and work. And then there'll be one on ending employment, the fair reasons for dismissal, what options do you have? So do keep an eye out. They're literally going to be going live over the next few days. They are advertised on our website. They're all free, and they're also advertised on the knowledge base for those who are knowledge base members. Now, Terry and I will be running a people strategy seminar in September. So it'll be great if you are available and want to join us, because we're actually going to be taking you through a whole day. It'll be very much practical. By the end of the day, you'll be coming away with your own people plan, a strategic people plan going into 2023. And it will take the whole employee life cycle. We'll understand what your challenges are, where your strengths are as a business, and help you define your people strategy for next year. So that is on the 20th of September. It is at Kettering Park Hotel. So please do check out our website. All the information is there. And hopefully we can get to see you and on that event. So that should be good. And then we also have a 7 key success seminar. So that's before the one I've just gone through on the 13th, again at the Kettering Park Hotel. And we're actually joining up with Norden's accountants for this. And it just follows on from the SME business survey, which we ran, gosh, December last year. And it's offering the opportunity for business owners to take an in-depth look at the findings of that report and what the next steps are for your business. So it is, again, a practical session, looking at how to maximize profit and potential alongside analyzing the sales process, mindset, cash flow, and much more. So check that out as well. That's also on our website, and it's bookable through Eventbrite. So that comes to leaves our webinar coming to an end. So if you do have further questions, please do email us, get in contact. That's a phone number there. Or our website. We always like to receive feedback, and if you've got any ideas for webinars in the future, then we're always keen to find out what they are. You will be sent a brief short survey to capture your feedback from this morning's webinar, so we do really appreciate your time in taking that. And equally, we do appreciate your time out of busy working life to attend this free webinar. We really do appreciate it. And so thank you for you all coming, asking your questions. Thank you to Terry for your insight and knowledge on the subject. And thank you, Drew, for helping support any technical queries in the background. So that ends our webinar today. So hopefully see you on the next webinar. Take care. Thank you.